Hello everyone, welcome to a very, very special Time Tunnellers video. My name is Matthew Wainwright and I'm a children's author, and I'm joined today by Eve McDonnell, who is also a children's author.
Hello everyone, how are you?
Thanks very much for joining us, Eve. It's great to have you. I was going to say on the programme, but I mean this is just Time Tunnellers, so it's great to have you. The Time Tunnellers again. Do you want to just tell us a bit about yourself, if that's all right?
I certainly will. Well, thank you first off for having me back. It's been a long time since I was with you last, I think possibly well over a year ago. So I have lots to tell you about. I have written a new book and I am absolutely dying to tell you a little bit about it. It's called The Last Boy, and it's a fairly chunky book. It's for roughly 9 years and up. So if you like a long story, which is full of history and wonder, hopefully you might pick up this one. But I'd love to tell you a wee bit about it, Matt, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Brilliant. Okay, this story is set in the 1800s and it follows the life of an actual real person. So the real person is called George Brewster. Now, George Brewster had an extraordinary job. He was a chimney sweep. Now, you might think, Matt, when you're getting your chimney swept, that you might stick a brush up from the bottom or a hoover perhaps and give it an old hoosh around. Well, in fact, back in the day, they actually sent children up inside chimneys to clean them. So they climbed right in. I don't recommend ever trying this, by the way. Crazy dangerous. And they climbed right in and climbed all the way up to the top of the chimney, brushing as they went along. So all the soot would fall down and then they would put that in a sack and they'd bring it away. So it sounds like a crazy job, and it was a crazy job. But unfortunately, people who didn't have much money back in the day used to sell their children, believe it or not, to master sweeps, to people who looked after a gang, perhaps, of chimney sweeps. And George Brewster was one of those chimney sweeps. Now, I found out about George when I was doing research, and I discovered something quite extraordinary about George. Now, he was one of thousands of chimney sweeps back in the day, but George made a huge difference to every single one of us. And do you know what that is? He was actually the person who helped change the laws, opened people's eyes a wee bit more about the horrible things that children were doing back in those days. They were sent to work during the day. They weren't lucky enough, all of them, to go to school. But because of George and people like him, laws started to change. So he was what I call a catalyst for change. So he was somebody who started the ball rolling that changed the law around labour for children in the UK and Ireland. So he was a very important boy, but long forgotten. So I wanted to basically retell his story. However, I don't write just historical fiction, so it's not like a history book. This is actually what I call a reimagining. So this basically is a story that takes George's time and changes it into a wondrous adventure full of shooting stars and all sorts of things that maybe the real George didn't get to witness.
Lovely, thank you very much. I mean, I'm reading the book at the moment, and I'm absolutely in love with it. As me and Eve have said before we started this conversation, I haven't quite managed to finish it yet, but she's let me know what I'm in for a little bit, and I can see it's going to be a very emotional journey. So I'm really looking forward to finishing it. It's an absolutely wonderful book, and I recommend it to everybody. It's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
So can I ask you? So George was chimney sweep. And subject very close to my heart because my book and Lord Shaftesbury, and I know all about the work that he did, but I think it's great you're focusing on him. Can you just tell us a bit about why you decided to pick George in particular? Out of, like you said, there's thousands of chimney sweeps. What made him so particular? What drew him to you?
Well, strangely, and everything about my writing comes from a strangely moment, because I always have my eyes open. I'm always looking for sort of the wonder in the world. And when I come across something that's kind of intriguing, I kind of put a pin in it. I keep it, and I think I could use that in a story. And one day that sort of thing happened. I was actually scrolling on a screen, half asleep, and I read a tiny little story about a little boy who was 12 years old, but he wasn't a chimney sweep. It wasn't George. It was another boy altogether. This little boy was living in Ireland in the 1800s, but he was living in a workhouse. Now, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of what a workhouse was back in the day. A dreadful place to end up, unfortunately. The poorest of the poor would end up in the workhouse, and it wouldn't be a very pleasant experience living in a workhouse. And this little boy was in a workhouse. He was stuck there, trying to survive day to day, a really tough life. But it turned out that this little boy was apparently an absolute genius at maths with his numbers. And this started to spread around. People started to spread that rumour that there was this little boy stuck in the workhouse who was an incredible genius. So this businessman, a local businessman, found out about this and thought, I could make use of this. So he went to visit the workhouse, and he basically plucked that boy out of the workhouse and out of poverty and gave him a job, a career, a home, a whole new magical life. And anyway, I scrolled on. That was all in one little post. I scrolled on, thought no more about it. But of course, that story started to grow legs inside my head. I wanted to know, how did that boy get all the knowledge he needed to be such a genius at his maths? Surely you can't just be the genius like that. Surely you need to learn it, that knowledge. So I started to wonder, and I went back to try and find that post, but poof, like a shooting star, it was gone. So I thought, this is very unusual. I'm going to have to make up a story myself. So I imagined this little boy who was great with his numbers. And I thought to myself, surely he would be able to predict things with his numbers. He might even be able to predict something as wonderful as a meteor shower, where you've got loads and loads of shooting stars flying over your head. So I had this wonderful, wondrous event in my mind, and I had this little boy who was a genius at maths, and I thought, I need to put them together. Where could this happen? How could this happen? So I imagined that the little boy would have stolen that knowledge out of a huge big house that maybe had a really good library, and maybe that library was full of science books. So I could start to feel this setting growing inside my mind. And then a friend of mine said, I know where he was. He was in Birr Castle. And Birr Castle is a castle in the very centre of Ireland. But at the time, it was the centre of the universe because it had the world's largest telescope. It's the size of a whale. It's called a Leviathan, and it's the size of a whale, a huge big telescope. And I thought, that's the place. That's exactly the place that this story was going to be set. But I wondered, how did this little boy get into the library to steal the knowledge? And I could imagine him sitting on the rooftop looking at the shooting stars. And I thought, of course, he goes down the chimney. So one thing led to another. I started to research chimney sweeps. I thought, maybe my boy is a chimney sweep. And suddenly I remember finding a little paragraph, one single paragraph, not unlike that one little social media post. And it mentioned a little paragraph about George Brewster, age 12. He died in 1875 after getting stuck inside a chimney. And I thought, that's my boy. That's all the information I had. And I thought, that's it. I'm going to print this out because I didn't want this to disappear like the social media posts that I'd seen. And I kept that one piece of paper and I thought, this is the main character in my story. And that's where it all began. Absolutely. It's amazing how all these bits and pieces start to come together to create a story.
That is how stories grow, right? You know, you see something, and I think it's always really important when you see something, you hang on to it. If you want to write a story, you go, actually, you know what? That's really precious. It might, like your story, like your article, it might be gone, but you hung on to it in your mind and it fixed in there and you thought, okay, I can hang on to that. And I think a lot of our listeners, if they want to write their own stories, I think that's probably good advice for them, isn't it? You see something that makes you feel something, you grab it, you hang on to it.
You do.
I can make a story out of that.
Understandably, when we're writing our stories, they can take some time. So sometimes they can take a year, to write a whole novel. But even when you're writing a short story, it can take quite a bit of time. So I always recommend that when you're writing any story, no matter what it is that teacher says, let's write a story about X, Y, or Z, put something in that story that really fascinates you. that you really love. It could be chocolate, it could be soccer, it could be absolutely anything. But if you introduce that into your story, you're going to love spending time with that story, and you'll keep writing then. So it's a great idea to bring all those things that interest you into a story. And it's great. It's easy. You can do that when you have a big chunky novel like one of these.
But loads of stuff in it.
I did.
So on that topic of finding things and seeing things that interest you and reading things, I noticed when I was reading, and I've noticed this in all of your books, that objects and things and found things seem to be very important. I can see from behind you that clearly it's something that's very important to you in your life. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, because George has his little box of things that he's found up chimneys and treasures that he keeps. That's very, very important to him, and they all have their own particular meaning, and they all remind him of particular things in his life. Just wondering if you could tell us a bit about why objects are so important to you and why you feel they're so important, in your books as well.
Yeah, well, I am a bit of a treasure hunter as well as a writer. I'm a treasure hunter, but I also am something else, and that's called a wonderlarker. And you wouldn't have ever heard of a wonderlarker before because I made up the word. And a wonderlarker is actually, the name itself came from an interesting background. Have you ever heard of a mudlarker?
I have heard of mudlarkers. I wonder whether any of our listeners have heard of mudlarkers. They might have done.
They might have done. A mudlarker is somebody, again, from the 1800s. I love the 1800s, clearly, where little boys and girls would go to work as well. Not cleaning chimneys this time, but what they would do is walk along the edge of a river, or sometimes even on the beach, but mostly along the edge of a river where it's very muddy. That's where the word mud larking came from. And they are larking about searching for treasure that's been lost and buried in the mud. And they would pull that treasure out and they would have a look at it and they would see if they can clean it up, and perhaps try and sell it. Now, when I say treasure, it could even be just a lump of coal that could have been sold, or it might be a piece of jewellery that they can fix up and sell, but they'd make some money by selling these bits and pieces, and then they could buy food. So that is how they survived. So that is what a mudlarker is. So a wonderlarker, I'm not kind of like walking around in the mud. That does happen too. But I am searching not just for treasure, as in sparkly silver bits. I am looking for treasure that is wondrous. So it could be a treasure from nature, for example. So when I'm looking for something, I'll find it and I'll think, oh, here's a beautiful pebble. Let me see if I can find one here. I've loads to choose from. Sorry now. But if I choose a pebble, say this one here, and I don't have my wonderlarking hat on, I will say that's a lovely grey pebble that I found on the beach. It's got some nice markings on it and it's got a hole in it like this. And I think no more of it. But if I have my wonderlarking hat on, I'm seeing something else completely differently. This is suddenly a portal to a magical place. And if I look through it, I might even see a completely different world. And then I start to imagine that different world. Oh, maybe I can time travel if I go through this hole. And I start to create a story inside my mind. And lo and behold, if I let that idea keep growing inside my mind, I'll eventually produce another book. So this one is actually made from exactly that. I found a stone with a hole in it and created a whole time traveling adventure with it. So that's why I love my objects. I look at my objects and I try and find the magic in every single object. And sometimes I even put them together on what I call a treasure chain. So you can see each one of these little objects that I found, they all have a little story attached. I reckon this bit here was perhaps Santa Claus's button. Goodness knows what magic would happen if you smoked out of this filthy pipe. This one here is a piece of blue sea glass, and I think that came from a gorgeous chalice. And there were secrets shared every time they took a sip out of that chalice. And this key, well, goodness knows where that key would open. So there's stories hidden inside every single object. And that's where I get my stories from. Every story I've ever written has really kind of come from some object or something wondrous in nature in the beginning of it. And that's why objects are important to me.
And I think that's lovely because I know our books are quite different. Mine are very much like, okay, it's trying to base it as much as possible just in real history, and I stay there. And you start with a starting off point of real history, and you take flight, and you find that wonder, and you say, well, where is my imagination going to take me, and what story am I going to tell? But we talked about this before we started, that actually the two things are not so very different, because when you're doing history and you're looking at an object or you're looking at a painting of someone, what you're doing is you're imagining, but you're trying to think, okay, what could life have been like that for that person? And as a historical novelist, obviously you then carry on and go, well, actually, I don't know what life could have been like, so I'm going to make it up and I'm going to try and put the details in. But that's what we're always doing with history, and I think that's what really fascinates me about history and then about storytelling and the mixture between the two. And the beauty of it is that anybody can do that. Anybody can be a historian and a storyteller, because you just have to walk around like you do with that hat on. Any kid can do it.
An invisible hat.
That's
yes.
it. Yeah.
We all have a wonderlarking hat. But you're so right, Matt, because I'm reading your book at the moment, as it happens. The only regret that I have is that I didn't read your book before I wrote my book, because it is so rich in detail and so rich in history that by reading something like that, it sends me straight back to that time. And I'm walking alongside the characters, and I can smell the air, and I can feel the cold, and I can see everything that's going on around me as though I've time traveled. And that's what a good story will do. It will really put you there with those characters. And whether you base your story primarily on the historical detail, or if you add in what we call a little bit of fantasy or a little bit of wonder, you can do both. And as you say, it's there for the taking. If we look at our history books are the most fascinating source for story ideas. So if you look at any page, you can start, okay, you can research and you can make it more factual than fantasy, or you can decide, no, I'm going to add a big dose of fantasy on this story. Maybe it's set in the Stone Age or whatever it might be. And you can start adding in a whole host of characters and make a wild adventure where they time travel all the way to the year 2024. So you can do anything that you want once you have the basics there in your book for you. And you can create a whole new adventure all out of here.
Exactly. And that's the great thing about stories, is whatever story you write is your story. So you can do whatever you want with it. And there's no rules to say you have to do this.
No rules whatsoever.
And, you have to do and that's the great thing. That's what we'd always say to people. So, okay. So on that, I've got another question for you, because what I found really, really fascinating and wonderful about The Last Boy, about your latest book, was the fact that you had science, superstition, and magic. And I'm going to kind of make those three things separate things, but all sitting alongside each other. So you have the science with George and his equations. He's just an incredible mathematician. He can predict things. You have the meteor showers. You have that amazing telescope, the Leviathan, all those wonderful objects and things that people make. Then you have the superstition. You have how people are reacting to the meteor showers and their fears and what they're thinking about. And George looking at them and thinking, yeah, but if you knew that this was just comet passing by, the Earth is passing through the tail of that comet. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. We think science has to be boring. It's not. Science is incredible and wonderful. But then alongside that, you also have, and this is what you do so well in your books, you have magic and wonder. And I'm not going to call it magic as in like, oh, it's Harry Potter and Wizards of the thing. It's that feeling of, okay, there's something more here. There's a sense of wonder and hope. And so I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you put those things together and how you feel about that, and why that's important to you, because that's something that's so wonderful about all of your books.
Yeah. Thank you. I suppose it's a bit like baking a cake, and you have all of the basic ingredients. So you have your flour and so forth, but you sometimes need to add a little bit of sugar, and that sugar gives it that little bit of something special. We all love a little bit of sugar, and that's how I see my wonder in my stories, that you can have a story. I was writing this story, and it can be quite a harrowing story when you listen to the history of chimney sweeps and what they had to go through. Some of these children were very, very young as 5 and 6 years old, and they were sent up these chimneys, sometimes as many as 20 a day. So you can imagine how extremely difficult their lives would be So I could just write about that, but instead I was trying to reimagine what their life might have become. So poor old George, if he got stuck inside his chimney, I wondered when he was looking up trying to get out, instead of seeing just a little patch of black sky that he was trying to get to, maybe he saw a little shooting star flying across it. And I thought, ooh, interesting. Maybe he saw another and another and another. And then I thought, what would he wish for? Well, clearly, I think George would be wishing to be the last climbing boy, as we call them, the last climbing boy chimney sweep to ever grace this earth. So I thought maybe that's where the magic will come in. But if you remember, George Brewster in my story is a clever guy, loves his maths and loves scientific fact. So it kind of clashed a wee bit to think that he would believe in a shooting star. And that got me thinking an awful lot, because I know in my head sometimes when you look at magic or you think you see something wondrous, you think, am I imagining that? And you would like to think it's real. But sometimes you have to allow yourself to believe it's real. And Roald Dahl actually once said something which was really, really fascinating. He had a saying which was, you have to watch the world with glittering eyes, because those who don't believe in magic will never find it. So I like to believe in that, and I live my life by that I'm looking for the magic in everything. So that's why I try to bring that little bit of magic into the story as best I possibly could. And of course, who doesn't love a story about being able to predict things with numbers? It's not just about boring numbers, it's about the magic you can do with those numbers. So I like to bring the lightness in that way as well.
I think in anything, in maths and science and history and things which, okay, you children listening to this, sometimes you might say, okay, well, I find that boring at school, or I find that boring at school. Actually, there's wonder in all of these things. And I think if you can find that, and, you know, especially in something like numbers, I discovered this a lot later when I was growing up, that there is a wonder in numbers, and by then it was a little bit too late for me, but I could appreciate it. And there's wonderful things, and wonderful things happen when you start to play with numbers and you get into all the kinds of maths that they do at universities and things, but actually it almost like, it's like the world opens up like this big flower, and there's all these things you never would have known about before that you discover that are inside numbers and mathematics, and that's
Absolutely.
inside
Yeah.
anything.
I'll show you one little trick if I may. Just bear with me 1 second.
Please do.
Okay, it's to do with numbers, and it's to do with predicting. So if you remember, in the story of The Last Boy, George Brewster uses his numbers to predict things. So he's going to predict a huge big meteor storm so that he can wish on every single star. But sometimes you can play with numbers in a different way. Have you ever seen one of these?
I have. I wonder if any of our children watching have made one of these before. These are great.
These, aren't they great? These are called fortune tellers, and you can actually you can get a teacher to show you how to actually make one of these. They do take about maybe an hour to actually create one well. But if you have a look, you pick something on the outside. So I have signs, superstition, magic, and wonder. So what would you like to pick there, Matt?
I would like to pick, wonder, I think.
Wonder. So WONDER. And this is where the numbers come in. Now, can you see the numbers?
I can see some numbers in there. I can see the number 7, which is a very auspicious
Okay.
number.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, pick another number.
This time I'll pick the number 3.
Okay, I am going to tell you what your fortune is. I'm going to predict it with the numbers. Number 3, it says, look up when you're outside today. Can you see a heart-shaped cloud? Do, and you'll find sunshine will come on your special day. Do you have a special day coming up, Matt?
I can't think that I do. I've got some birthdays coming up in a couple of months' time.
Well, there you go. You're going to have sunshine if you can find a heart-shaped cloud today. The numbers have predicted it.
There you go. Well, that's fantastic. Well, I hope everyone will be able to make those. You can definitely download patterns and tutorials, and I'm sure lots of teachers will know how to make those. I think that'd be a great thing for kids to do. I think we're going to close soon, but the last thing I really want to ask about was that idea about, seeing wonder in the world and seeing the world in different ways. All of your characters in your books have like really particular ways of seeing the world. So George, he sees in terms of numbers, but it's not just boring numbers. Numbers bring the world alive to him, and that helps him to see the world in a really particular way, and that helps him to understand the world. And I know all your other characters have their own really specific ways of looking at the world, like looking through like a lens, you know, like when you look through a piece of blue glass and you see things in a particular way. All of your characters have that, but you know, inside their minds. Again, you know, would you just be able to tell us a little bit about why that's important to you, and you know what you think, you know, it means and how it would help children who are reading your books?
I think this is where I suppose the whole craft of writing stories comes in. When you're writing a character, um, you really, really, as the author, you need to get your head almost inside that character's head. So you have to really be able to place yourself in their world. And if you read one of my books, you'll notice that they're always in third person. What that means is it's being narrated from a different perspective. So we're saying that he did this, he did that. Instead of I did it, which would be first person. If you're reading a book that says I went there or I saw that, that is in first person. But when I'm saying he did something, it's in third person. And that can mean that you're a little bit detached from your character. So how I write my third person characters is I make them what's called close third person. So it's almost like we are living George's life when we go through that story. I want you to see the world through his eyes. I want you to feel what he feels. I want you to see how things are happening around him and interpret them the way he would. So even though you might know that a car, for example, in those days would have worked a certain way, he didn't know because he's never seen one before. So we need to see it the way he would see it, that it's some sort of crazy contraption going down the road making an awful lot of noise. And that's all he would have called it. He wouldn't have said, there's a motor car. So we need to make sure that when we're writing that we are really seeing it from his perspective, from your character's perspective. And I think once you can do that, it makes his world make a huge amount of sense. And it helps us kind of feel what he feels and feel empathy for him. And I think that's the kind of the key thing, is to be able to learn how to empathize with other people who might see the world a little bit differently to how we see it. So if you have a friend who thinks of things slightly differently or sees things slightly differently, maybe spend some time trying to imagine how it is from their perspective, get into their head and see how they see the world. And it's quite eye-opening. And it's a lovely thing to do, because then you can share things together and see through their eyes instead.
To end on. Well, Eve, thanks so much for your time. It's been absolutely wonderful talking about your book. I've absolutely loved reading it, like I said, and I would encourage everybody watching this video to go out and get your copy. Eve assures me that there will not be a dry eye left by the end of reading the book, but in a good way, and that's
We
what
all
stories
love
can
George
do.
Brewster, yeah.
They make us feel things very deeply, and you know, when joy and sadness and hope and wonder and all these things mix together, I think that makes for an incredibly special story, and I think it makes all of us better, it makes the world a better place. So all that remains to be said is thank you so much for joining us, Eve. Thanks
Thank
for your
you so
time.
much
Thanks
for
being
having
here.
me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And to everyone watching this video, I hope you enjoy reading the book. Hope you enjoy making a fortune teller. I hope you enjoy maybe doing some wonderlarking of your own, writing your own stories, coming up with your own characters. And I suppose, as always, happy time tunneling. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye, everyone. Thank you.